1946, a boy named Charles Dyer arrived at the Walter E. Fernald State School in Waltham, Massachusetts. He was 10 years old. His family couldn't care for him. The intake paperwork described him as a ward of the state, a designation that, in mid-century America, meant something very specific. It meant he belonged to no one. It meant decisions about his body, his health, and his future would be made by people who had never met his parents and never would. Charles was not sick. He was not dangerous. He was a child who had been classified as feeble-minded, a word the institution used freely, stamped onto files and carved into the identity of every boy who walked through its doors. The Fernald School had been operating since 1848. By the time Charles arrived, it housed over 2,000 residents, most of them children, most of them forgotten the moment they were admitted. But Charles was about to be remembered, not by the people who were supposed to protect him, but by scientists who needed his body for an experiment. Within months of his arrival, Charles was invited to join something called the Science Club. It sounded exciting. The boys who joined got special privileges. They went on trips to baseball games. They ate better food. They received extra portions of milk and cereal. For children who lived in overcrowded dormitories, who slept in rows of iron beds, who were disciplined with isolation and restraint, the Science Club felt like a reward. It was not a reward. It was a recruitment tool. The Science Club was the creation of researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, working in partnership with the Quaker Oats Company. Their objective was straightforward. Quaker Oats wanted to understand how the body absorbed minerals from cereal. Specifically, they wanted data that could help them compete with Cream of Wheat, a rival brand that claimed superior nutritional value. MIT wanted to study the metabolism of iron and calcium in the human body. And both parties needed test subjects who would eat what they were told, ask no questions, and have no one advocating on their behalf. The children at Fernald were perfect. Between 1946 and 1953, approximately 74 boys at the Fernald State School were fed oatmeal and milk laced with radioactive traces, specifically radioactive iron and radioactive calcium. The isotopes were mixed directly into their breakfast. The boys ate it without knowing. They were never told what was in the food. They were never told they were part of an experiment. They were never given the option to refuse. Their parents, the ones who could be located, received letters. These letters were carefully worded. They described the Science Club as a nutritional study. They mentioned that the boys would receive a grueling diet rich in all the vitamins and minerals necessary for growth. They mentioned the trips to baseball games. They did not mention radiation. They did not mention MIT. They did not mention Quaker Oats. And they did not mention that the researchers had obtained the radioactive materials from the Atomic Energy Commission, the same federal agency responsible for America's nuclear weapons program. The consent forms, to the extent they existed at all, were masterpieces of omission. Now, it's important to understand what was known at the time. By the mid-1940s, the dangers of radiation exposure were not a mystery. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated the catastrophic effects of radiation on the human body. Scientists working on the Manhattan Project had already documented radiation sickness, cellular damage, and increased cancer risk. The very researchers conducting the Fernald experiments operated within institutions that understood these risks intimately. They chose to proceed anyway. The doses administered to the Fernald boys were relatively low. That became the cornerstone of every defense mounted in the decades that followed. The researchers argued that the levels of radiation were comparable to what a person might receive from normal background exposure or a series of medical X-rays. And on a purely technical level, this may have been true. But that argument misses the point entirely. The point was never just about dosage. The point was about choice. These children did not choose to be irradiated. These children did not understand what was being done to them. These children were selected precisely because they were powerless, because they lived in an institution that had total control over their bodies, because they had been labeled as mentally deficient and therefore unworthy of the protections afforded to other human beings. The experiments at Fernald were not isolated. They were part of a much larger pattern. During the Cold War, the United States government funded dozens of radiation experiments on unwitting human subjects. Prisoners were irradiated. Pregnant women were given radioactive iron cocktails. Hospital patients were injected with plutonium. The Atomic Energy Commission funded studies at universities across the country, and the test subjects were almost always drawn from the same populations: the incarcerated, the institutionalized, the poor, and the disabled. People who couldn't say no. People whose absence wouldn't be noticed. At Fernald, the experiments continued for 7 years. The results were published in academic journals. The Quaker Oats Company used the data in its marketing. MIT researchers advanced their careers, and the boys of the science club went back to their dormitories, back to their iron beds, back to lives defined by neglect and regimentation. For decades, no one said a word. The truth didn't begin to surface until 1993, when a reporter named Scott Allen at the Boston Globe started investigating a broader story about Cold War-era radiation experiments. What he found at Fernald shocked even seasoned journalists. The paper trail was extensive: letters, research reports, funding documents from the Atomic Energy Commission. The evidence was not ambiguous. It was clinical, detailed, and damning. The story broke nationally. Former Fernald residents, now middle-aged and elderly men, came forward. Many of them had carried the memories of the science club for decades without understanding what had really happened. Charles Dyer was among them. He remembered the oatmeal. He remembered the trips. He remembered being told he was special. He did not remember being told he was a test subject. In 1994, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, tasked with investigating the full scope of government-sponsored radiation testing on American citizens. The committee's final report, published in 1995, confirmed what the survivors already knew. The Fernald experiments had been conducted without adequate informed consent. The children had been exploited. The institutions involved, MIT, Quaker Oats, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the federal government, had all failed in their most basic ethical obligations. The committee recommended acknowledgement. It recommended compensation. It recommended that the government formally apologize. What actually happened was considerably less dramatic. In 1997, MIT and Quaker Oats agreed to a settlement with the surviving former residents. The amount was $1.85 million, divided among approximately 30 plaintiffs. Each man received roughly $60,000 for being fed radioactive food as a child, for being lied to, for spending decades not knowing what had been done to their bodies. No one from MIT was disciplined. No one from Quaker Oats was held criminally responsible. No government official faced charges. The Fernald State School itself continued to operate until 2014, when it was finally closed, not because of the experiments, but because the era of large-scale institutionalization was ending. Today, the former Fernald campus sits largely empty. Some of the buildings have been repurposed. Some are crumbling. The grounds are quiet. There are no markers commemorating what happened to the boys of the science club. There is no plaque on the dining hall where radioactive oatmeal was served to children who thought they were being treated to something special. MIT remains one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Quaker Oats remains one of the most recognized food brands in America. The legacies of these institutions were not meaningfully damaged by what they did at Fernald. The story surfaced, generated headlines, produced a modest settlement, and then receded into the background noise of history. And that's what's most disturbing about the Fernald experiments. Not the radiation itself, though that is disturbing enough. What's most disturbing is how the system worked exactly as designed. The children were chosen because they were disposable. The records were obscured because the institutions had the power to obscure them. The consequences were minimal because the victims were people society had already decided didn't matter. Charles Dyer spent years after the settlement trying to bring more attention to what had happened. He spoke publicly. He gave interviews. He described what it felt like to learn, as a grown man, that the people who were supposed to care for him had instead used him as a laboratory animal. He described the betrayal not in dramatic terms, but in quiet, measured ones, the way a person speaks when they've had decades to sit with a wound that never fully closed. He died in 2017. He was 81 years old. The question that remains is not whether the Fernald experiments were wrong. That question was answered long ago. The question is, how many other experiments like this took place in institutions across America, in state schools, in orphanages, in hospitals for the chronically ill, that never made the newspapers? How many records were destroyed before anyone could find them? How many former residents went to their graves not knowing what had been done to them, carrying strange illnesses they could never explain, trusting institutions that had never earned that trust? The Fernald boys were told they were special. They were told they were part of something important, and in a terrible way, they were. They were proof of what happens when powerful institutions decide that some lives are worth less than data, that some children exist not to be raised, but to be used. Some records were meant to be forgotten, but the boys of the science club were not records. They were children, and they deserved better than a settlement check and a silence that lasted half a century.